SS uniforms stand among the most striking military images of the last century, clad in jet black tunics, adorned with polished insignia, and topped by distinctive steel helmets. These men became an unmistakable presence across Europe. But what became of these imposing symbols after the downfall of Nazi Germany? During the years of the Third Reich, thousands upon thousands of SS helmets were manufactured. Yet by the time the war ended, only a fraction remained. Many were scooped up by advancing soldiers as battlefield keepsakes. Others simply vanished into the rubble of a defeated nation. Still, one helmet in particular would go on to capture the fascination of historians and collectors alike, an object that resurfaced decades later, revealing an unexpected journey through war and memory. So stay with us, because by the end of this story, you'll see how a single piece of headgear became one of the most intriguing wartime relics ever found. Now, to truly understand the weight behind these helmets and the uniforms that went with them, we have to start at the very beginning. The SS didn't spring up overnight as the vast organization we know from history books. It actually began in 1923 as a modest protective squad. Their original role was little more than safeguarding Adolf Hitler and key figures of the fledgling Nazi movement during the violent street brawls and tense political rallies of the time. But this humble security detail wouldn't remain small for long. Under the calculated hand of Heinrich Himmler, the SS evolved rapidly. By 1932, less than a decade after its formation, it had grown into an independent paramilitary body inside the Nazi Party's own hierarchy. Its numbers had swelled to around 50,000 men, all carefully chosen and subjected to rigorous training designed to forge not just disciplined fighters but ideologically steadfast loyalists. This was more than a political militia. It was being molded into a devoted elite. Himmler understood that appearance was power. He wanted his organization to stand apart, to project an image of both strict order and quiet menace. So he set about crafting a distinct visual identity. Central to this was the choice of black, a color long associated in Europe with formality, mystery, and even intimidation. When these dark uniforms were paired with the iconic death's head insignia, or Totenkopf, a skull emblem once used by Prussian cavalry and special detachments, the message was unmistakable. The SS was to be seen as a force above the ordinary, separate from the rest of the German state, and bound by its own fierce code. Even the eagle insignia worn by the SS set them apart. Unlike the standard Nazi eagles seen on Wehrmacht or party uniforms, the SS adopted a unique stylization. It was a subtle but deliberate statement, reinforcing the idea that the SS stood outside, and even above, the usual state apparatus. Himmler was meticulous about such distinctions, understanding that small differences in symbols could cultivate a powerful sense of exclusivity. Choosing black was no accident either. In the political climate of early 20th century Europe, black already carried heavy associations. Mussolini's supporters in Italy had popularized it. Their ranks were famously known as the Black Shirts. Himmler recognized how effective that stark color was at projecting discipline, unity, and a certain chilling mystique. By clothing his men in black, he not only set them visually apart from Germany's standard military formations, but also tapped into a psychological impact that made observers instinctively uneasy. It suggested secrecy, absolute control, and a kind of untouchable authority, all qualities he wanted the SS to embody. Beyond intimidation, the uniforms also served to cultivate pride among the men who wore them. The high-collared tunics, sharp tailoring, and polished boots gave an air of elegance, almost aristocracy, which only deepened the sense of the SS being a hand-picked order. Several German firms took on the mass production of these garments. A good 80% of my viewers are younger men, older men, and if you're anything like the men we talk about on this channel, you've been taught one thing: keep pushing forward, don't complain, carry the weight, whatever the cost. But there's a reason so many of those veterans came home broken on the inside. Even today, veteran suicide is at its worst ever. They didn't have anyone to talk to, and even if they did, maybe many would still be here. That mindset hasn't gone away. Most men still bottle things up, still struggle in silence, still feel like they have to figure it out alone. That's why I've partnered with BetterHelp, a platform that connects you with a credentialed therapist online to help anyone, man or woman, no waiting rooms, no judgment, just someone trained to help you understand what you're going through and how to work through it, military or not. Whether you're 22 or 52, if you've ever felt stuck, angry, numb, or like no one really gets it, this might be your sign to take that first step. Use my link, betterhelp.com/historyatwar, 10% off your first month of therapy. Linked below and top of the comments. Some battles don't leave scars you can see, but they're just as real. With Hugo Boss becoming particularly notable for fulfilling large contracts, they followed specifications laid down by SS leadership, ensuring that the cut and fabric quality met strict standards. These were not just utility clothes, they were designed to impress both comrades and civilians alike. But while factories could churn out endless ranks of black tunics and breeches, equipping the SS with steel helmets proved a far more complicated matter. As the organization expanded rapidly from a bodyguard contingent to field units ready for combat, demand for helmets soared. Yet the German army, itself racing to rearm and prepare for looming conflicts, had no surplus to spare. This left Himmler in a difficult position. He had to secure alternative sources, often negotiating directly with private manufacturers or leaning on the wider arms industry to prioritize SS contracts. The result was a patchwork supply, especially in the early years, that would shape the distinctive look of SS headgear for years to come. Securing enough helmets for the growing ranks of the SS proved to be one of Himmler's early logistical headaches. Unlike the regular army, the SS didn't have immediate access to state armories or Wehrmacht stockpiles. In the early days, they had to look elsewhere, and much of that surplus came from Germany's own turbulent recent past. The first significant batches of helmets issued to SS formations were inherited from the Freikorps, those loosely organized right-wing paramilitary bands made up largely of World War I veterans. In the chaotic aftermath of Germany's defeat, the Freikorps had been formed to counter communist revolts and political unrest sweeping the fledgling Weimar Republic. They played a decisive, if often brutal, role in quelling uprisings and restoring a kind of fragile order, but their heavy-handed methods and radical ideologies eventually made them politically inconvenient, leading to their official disbandment in the early 1920s. Of course, not all these hardened men simply faded away. Many drifted into new nationalist movements or found familiar ground in the Nazi Party's early street militias, notorious for their brawls and intimidation tactics. A fair number went on to join the SS as it evolved under Himmler's stewardship, bringing with them old gear, including the steel helmets they had once worn on Germany's fractured streets. These helmets were largely relics of the Great War. They included the M16 and later M18 models, still available in modest quantities. Though robust, they were far from uniform, bearing various dents, field repairs, and the ghost marks of old insignia. When Hitler rose to power in 1933, Himmler hoped to finally tap into official army reserves to better equip his units. But the Reichswehr, soon to transform into the Wehrmacht, guarded its supplies jealously. The army's own expansion plans left little room to divert stocks to an organization that, while politically powerful, stood outside its command structure. So Himmler turned outward. Even as Germany remained technically bound by the strict limits of the Versailles Treaty, SS procurement officers quietly sourced additional helmets from beyond the country's borders. Surplus M17 steel helmets from Austria and Czechoslovakia were purchased and quietly brought into SS depots. These were veterans of another war entirely, now destined to be repurposed for the ambitious plans of a new German movement. To mold these varied helmets into something that visually belonged to the SS, significant modifications were made. They were stripped, refinished, and given that unmistakable glossy black coating that became a visual signature of early SS ceremonial and guard units. Inside, many were refitted with new leather liners and fresh chin straps to ensure they were both serviceable and consistent in presentation. Parallel to these refurbishments, German manufacturers began rolling out new production runs based on the same tried and tested World War I designs. These would become known collectively as the M18 RZM, named after the Reichszeugmeisterei, the office responsible for overseeing Nazi uniform standards. The model even picked up the nickname Himmler helmet, in part because Himmler himself owned and wore examples of this very type during formal appearances. These helmets soon sported additional markings to tie them directly to the SS. On the right side was the emblem of the SS runes, a striking double lightning symbol that encapsulated the organization's sense of mystique and exclusivity. Early on, these emblems were applied by hand, either painted directly onto the steel or stenciled. But as the SS grew and demanded more consistency, they moved to water-slide decals, ensuring a sharp, identical finish across thousands of helmets. Meanwhile, the left side typically bore another decal featuring the party's colors and swastika banner, linking the SS unmistakably to Hitler's broader regime. These helmets became especially prominent within the ranks of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the unit originally raised as Hitler's personal guard. This formation began as a compact circle of hand-picked men, but would expand dramatically into one of the most recognized and heavily photographed divisions of the Waffen-SS. Before the war erupted across Europe, it was common to see these black-helmeted guards posted with rigid formality outside the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, or marching in meticulously orchestrated parades designed to showcase the regime's power. Over time, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, often simply referred to as the Leibstandarte, transformed from a modest personal bodyguard unit into one of the most prestigious and formidable formations within the Waffen-SS. These men became a familiar sight in Berlin. They could often be seen standing rigid watch outside the Reich Chancellery, clad in immaculate black uniforms with their distinctive helmets gleaming under the sun. They were also a centerpiece of the grand military parades, designed to project Germany's renewed strength and unity, their columns moving with mechanical precision through streets lined with cheering crowds. One of the most striking public showcases of these black helmets came in 1940. Following the rapid campaign in France, Berlin hosted a massive victory parade, a spectacle meant to highlight the zenith of German power in Western Europe. It was during this triumphal display that Himmler's SS units, still outfitted with their ceremonial black helmets, made their last large-scale appearance in such formal regalia. But as the war dragged on and shifted into new and harsher phases, practicality began to override pageantry. By 1941, even the ceremonial guards posted at the Chancellery traded in their black uniforms for the more subdued field grey, known as Feldgrau, which had long been standard among frontline formations. This transition wasn't merely cosmetic, it reflected the growing demands of a total war where every resource was stretched thin. The glossy black helmets of the early SS were increasingly set aside, replaced by the M35 steel helmet that had become the benchmark of German combat gear. This model offered improved ballistic protection and was far better suited to the rigors of modern warfare. What then became of those older black helmets? Many were gathered up and stored away in military depots, effectively mothballed as surplus equipment. However, not all stayed idle. As Allied bombing intensified over German cities, there was a rush to bolster civil defense measures. Numerous SS helmets were repurposed for Luftschutz units, the air raid protection services tasked with helping civilians during bombing raids, managing shelters, and clearing rubble. In the desperate twilight of the Reich, when Germany's cities were already in ruins and Soviet and Western forces were converging on the heart of Europe, yet another wave of redistribution occurred. The Volkssturm was formed, a last-ditch militia cobbled together from older men, young boys and veterans long out of regular service. Lacking adequate supplies, these hastily assembled units drew from any stocks available, which likely included the once ceremonial black helmets. Thus, pieces originally intended to symbolize elite power and ceremony found themselves pressed into grim duty on makeshift barricades and in the final chaotic battles of the war. As the final months of the war unfolded, the once mighty structures of the Third Reich rapidly disintegrated. High-ranking officials fled their offices and country estates, abandoning properties filled with personal effects and ceremonial relics that only months before had symbolized power and privilege. When Allied troops swept through these areas, they often found themselves stepping into villas and bunkers that were virtual treasure troves, not only of documents and plans, but of uniforms, medals, and other items that offered a tangible link to the regime's now collapsing apparatus. Among the most sought-after discoveries were the black helmets tied to Himmler's SS. For Allied soldiers, these items weren't just intriguing mementos, they represented undeniable evidence that Germany's most feared elite forces had finally been broken. To take home an SS helmet was to own a piece of a fallen giant, a souvenir that could one day tell a vivid story to family and neighbors far removed from the ravages of Europe. Himmler himself possessed a small collection of these distinctive helmets. Over the years, he had worn various models at parades, official inspections, and gatherings meant to showcase the order and pageantry of the SS. Surviving photographs from the period show Himmler with at least 3 different styles, each subtly distinct. One was almost certainly a refurbished M16, a World War I leftover, likely pulled from old party stockpiles, or perhaps even surplus held by Freikorps veterans who had folded into Nazi paramilitary ranks. To a casual observer, these helmets all looked roughly the same, but collectors and historians could tell them apart by details most would overlook. For instance, the original M16 featured prominent screws at the base of the skirt to anchor its chin strap, while later German-made M18, as well as the RZM regulated versions produced for the SS in the 1930s, eliminated this feature for a cleaner line. Then there was the Austro-Hungarian M17, which closely resembled the M16 but carried slightly smaller screws set a bit higher along the helmet's rim. Despite these variations, the overall silhouette was consistent enough that at SS ceremonies, the formations presented a unified appearance, the distinctions lost amid the glossy black paint and matching decals. If any of these helmets could be tied directly back to Himmler, their historical weight would be extraordinary. Even before the war ended, such a direct personal connection would have elevated a simple piece of steel into an invaluable artifact, a physical trace of the man who had shaped the SS into what it became. Himmler's personal life offered even more windows into this world of elite regalia and secluded luxury. Over the years, he established several residences across Germany, but his favorite retreat was in Bavaria. In 1934, he purchased a handsome villa on the shores of Lake Tegernsee in the quiet town of Gmund. The house did not remain a simple country dwelling for long. Himmler oversaw renovations that added not only aesthetic touches but also practical reinforcements, a guard station, heavy doors, and an air raid shelter, all signs of how deeply security concerns had become intertwined with daily life for the Reich's leaders. It was here that Himmler lived with his wife Margaret and their daughter Gudrun in the years before the war fully engulfed Europe. The villa's location, not far from Munich, was no coincidence. Munich was more than just another German city. It was a symbolic heartland of the National Socialist movement, the place where Hitler had first cut his political teeth and the site of many early party rallies. That proximity made it a favoured hub for many top officials, who often kept apartments or second homes there to remain close to the ideological core of the regime. Interestingly, despite his immense power within the Nazi hierarchy, Himmler never secured a permanent residence at Obersalzberg, the exclusive mountain enclave where Hitler and other top figures like Hermann Göring, Albert Speer, and Martin Bormann maintained lavish alpine retreats near the Berghof. This was no accident. Bormann, ever the political schemer, deliberately kept Himmler out of this tightly controlled circle, using his considerable influence to ensure that the SS chief was excluded from the community of Nazi elites who gathered there. Instead, whenever Himmler travelled to meet with Hitler in Bavaria, especially in the earlier years of the war, he stayed in high-end inns reserved for party officials or in guest houses specifically arranged for such visits. But Himmler's personal life was also shifting in ways that would lead him to carve out a different domestic arrangement. Over time, his marriage deteriorated. He separated from his wife Margareta and began living more openly with his mistress, Hedwig Potthast. She moved into a house in Schönau am Königssee, not far from Berchtesgaden, another picturesque Bavarian spot close to Hitler's mountain headquarters. There, she raised Himmler's 2 children born out of wedlock. This residence became Himmler's informal home base whenever he was in the area. Like his other properties, it was upgraded to include accommodations for his personal security detail and an air raid shelter, reminders that even in such scenic surroundings, the threats of war and political violence were never far off. Yet despite this new arrangement, Himmler continued to visit Gmund at Lake Tegernsee, maintaining ties with his daughter Gudrun and keeping a foot in his earlier family life. As the tide of war turned dramatically against Germany, Himmler found himself drawn away from these Bavarian retreats. With the Red Army pushing deep into the heart of Germany and Western allies advancing from the other side, he left Berlin and moved north into Schleswig-Holstein. There he attempted one final political maneuver, trying to reach an understanding with the provisional government, led by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had been named Hitler's successor after Hitler's suicide on April 30th, 1945. Himmler hoped to broker some form of partial surrender to the Western Allies, perhaps preserving a fragment of influence or sparing certain territories from Soviet occupation. But these overtures fell flat. The remnants of German leadership were in no mood to entertain deals from a man so closely tied to the very machinery that had now collapsed around them. On May 21, 1945, Himmler was picked up by British forces while attempting to disguise himself as just another disheveled soldier among thousands. 2 days later, under circumstances still debated by historians, he took his own life in custody by biting down on a hidden cyanide capsule. Meanwhile, back in Bavaria, his properties were overrun. On May 4, 1945, soldiers from the 1st Battalion of the 306th Infantry Regiment, part of the Texas Division, moved into Gmund and took control of Himmler's lakeside villa, along with several vacation homes belonging to other prominent Nazi officials. They found the house deserted. Margaret and Gudrun had fled days earlier, driving into northern Italy, which at that point remained tenuously under German control. Left behind was a house still brimming with personal effects and documents, a snapshot of Himmler's private world, abruptly abandoned. To the American troops, it was a remarkable haul. They combed through rooms filled with official papers, tailored uniforms, ceremonial swords, and private correspondence. Among the most prized finds were the black SS helmets, especially those known to have been worn by Himmler himself during inspections and parades. As was typical in the final days of the war, soldiers eager for trophies quickly claimed many of these items. Some would vanish forever, spirited away into personal collections, or tucked into trunks to be brought back across the Atlantic. The search didn't end there. Just hours after securing Gmund, elements of another American division advanced on Berchtesgaden, the Alpine stronghold where many Nazi leaders had built their secluded homes. There they discovered Himmler's secondary residence in Schönau am Königssee. Though the house stood empty, it was much like Gmund inside, stocked with the trappings of Himmler's private and official life. In one of the garages, troops found his armoured limousine, the very vehicle used to shuttle between his residence and the Berghof or to nearby airfields, where he boarded flights on his personal Focke-Wulf 200 Condor, standard transport for top Nazi officials operating across occupied Europe. Like his villa, this house and its contents were thoroughly searched. Soldiers helped themselves to whatever struck their fancy, eager to carry home physical pieces of a regime whose sudden collapse had left so much of its material grandeur exposed and ownerless. Among the many American soldiers combing through these captured Bavarian properties was Corporal Raymond Decker, a member of the 4th Infantry Division. Decker's path to this point had already been long and harrowing. He had landed in Normandy just 6 days after D-Day, originally serving as a medical laboratory technician. Soon after, he was reassigned as a corpsman within the 4th Division, trailing the relentless advance through the dense, deadly Hurtgen forest, and then deeper into Germany as 1945 unfolded. By May 2nd of that year, Decker's division had arrived in the small town of Misbach, roughly 10 kilometers from Himmler's lakeside residence at Gmund. As occupation duties settled in, Soldiers did what armies throughout history have always done when surrounded by the abandoned spoils of a collapsed enemy. They collected keepsakes. For many, these items were far more than curiosities. They were tangible tokens of a long and costly campaign, reminders of the struggles that had brought them so deep into foreign soil. It was during this period that Deckard came into possession of a striking black SS helmet. The piece itself was originally a World War I model, later refurbished, repainted, and pressed into ceremonial service by Himmler's SS, likely around 1940. Evidence suggests the helmet was taken from Himmler's property at Gmund, the same villa where he had lived with his family before the war. Still, the precise trail it followed is murky. It's entirely possible that another soldier from the 306th Infantry, which had initially secured Gmund, retrieved it first and then traded or sold it to Deckard sometime during the weeks of occupation that followed. Regardless of exactly how it changed hands, the helmet stayed with Deckard until the war's end and accompanied him back to the United States. There, he resumed his life and continued his service, building a decorated military record that included the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart with an oak leaf cluster, the Good Conduct Medal, and 5 battle stars on his European Campaign Medal, silent acknowledgements of the grueling path he had marched across the continent. Decades later, long after Deckard's passing, his son made the decision to donate this remarkable artifact to the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York. Today, the helmet sits under protective glass as part of the museum's permanent exhibit, identified through careful research and provenance work as having once personally belonged to Heinrich Himmler. Its display transforms it from a private wartime memento into a preserved piece of global history, bridging the gap between the battlefield chaos of 1945 and modern efforts to study and understand that chapter. Had this helmet ever entered the open collector's market, it would likely have commanded an astonishing sum. In April 2022, for example, a far less significant helmet, one tied to Fritz Zull, an obscure Nazi Party member, sold at auction in the United States for nearly $10,000. Considering Himmler's central role in the regime and the extreme rarity of items directly linked to him, experts believe such a helmet could easily draw bids reaching into the tens of thousands, or far more, depending on the context and intensity of collector interest. This was not the only case. Allied soldiers found themselves in a world littered with abandoned artifacts. For many of them, prowling through seized bunkers, lavish estates, and smouldering headquarters became an unofficial sport, a chance to claim a piece of the defeated Reich for themselves. And among the most prized trophies were relics tied to the SS, an organization whose aura of elite secrecy made anything bearing its symbols doubly attractive. This wasn't mere speculation. Countless personal letters and GI memoirs describe how American and British troops would race each other through captured buildings, searching out anything stamped with runes or the menacing Totenkopf skull. Entire units developed informal contests over who could bring back the most striking memento. Helmets, of course, were high on the list, but so were other SS-marked items. Ceremonial daggers, cuff titles, belt buckles, and even documents that bore the lightning bolt runes. One American infantryman, writing home from Bavaria in May 1945, confessed almost gleefully that he and his squad made a game of it. They swept through abandoned police stations and party offices near Munich, each hoping to find an SS dagger still in its sheath. "If we came across a box or desk," he wrote, "it was like Christmas morning. Whoever opened it first had dibs. I traded 3 packs of Luckies for a death's head ring off some old uniform." Such rings, often inscribed inside with the soldier's initials and date of award, were personal symbols of loyalty to the SS, making them particularly desirable trophies. In Berchtesgaden, British troops who arrived shortly after American forces described a similarly frenzied hunt. Inside homes once owned by senior Nazi officials, they found everything from SS ceremonial swords to ornate guest books filled with signatures from visiting dignitaries. Some British soldiers even loaded up entire trunks of black tunics, cuffbands embroidered with unit names like Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and carefully wrapped boxes of medals intended for awards ceremonies that would now never take place. Beyond the clothing and weapons, there were also piles of administrative detritus that offered chilling insight into the bureaucracy of the SS. In Himmler's own properties, occupation soldiers uncovered shelves of personal correspondence, family photographs, meticulous property ledgers, stark reminders that behind the rigid uniforms were men who lived surprisingly domestic, sometimes even mundane lives, until their world abruptly collapsed. And yet, not every trophy taken by Allied hands ended up in a museum display or carefully documented archive. The vast majority simply travelled home with the men who found them, stashed in duffel bags and shipping crates. Many were proudly shown off to neighbours and relatives before being tucked away in attics, basements, or the backs of closets. Decades would pass, the veterans aging and eventually dying, while the artefacts they carried back from Europe lay quietly gathering dust. There are countless modern stories of families discovering these objects, often by accident. In Michigan, a woman cleaning out her late father's garage uncovered a trunk that contained, among other keepsakes, an SS officer's dress visor cap with silver skull insignia. She had grown up hearing stories that her father fought in France and Germany, but never realized he had brought home pieces of the defeated enemy's uniform. In rural Yorkshire, a grandson clearing an old wardrobe found a cardboard box filled with Luftschutz armbands, Hitler Youth knives, and 2 black SS tunics, relics taken by his grandfather, who had served with British forces in the Rhineland. The presence of these artifacts in ordinary homes is so widespread that auction houses across the world routinely handle estates turning up everything from SS cuff titles to field gear stamped with runes. One well-known London militaria dealer remarked in an interview, "You wouldn't believe how often families come in saying they've found something with odd markings in Grandad's attic. Often it's an SS belt buckle or even a Totenkopf ring, and they had no idea what it really was." This enduring presence of SS memorabilia in private hands is also reflected in the modern collector market, which remains as active as ever. Some buyers seek helmets or daggers simply out of fascination with military history and craftsmanship. Either way, the prices can climb quickly. Even relatively common Waffen-SS M42 helmets, if well preserved and bearing intact decals, can fetch thousands of dollars. Items with strong provenance, a documented connection to specific officers or known units, soar far higher. But while collectors value these items as historical artifacts, they also carry undeniable moral complexity. Museums often strive to place them in educational contexts, using them to illustrate how ordinary men were absorbed into powerful ideological machines. Private owners, however, vary widely in how they treat such relics. Some keep them locked away, reluctant to discuss them. Others display them as macabre centerpieces, eager to recount stories of how their fathers or grandfathers liberated them in 1945. Meanwhile, countless other SS artifacts remain hidden, waiting for the day someone stumbles across them, perhaps in a dusty crate under old fishing gear or behind a false wall in a long-neglected attic. Each one is a silent witness to an era of extraordinary upheaval, its survival owed more to chance than design. In this way, the remnants of the SS, once paraded through city squares as symbols of absolute power, now rest quietly in suburban basements and rural barns, their full stories often unknown even to the families who unwittingly keep them. And that brings us to the end of today's documentary. If you enjoyed this exploration into the forgotten relics of the past, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It helps us grow and allows us to keep uncovering stories like this. The ones tucked away in attics, hidden behind old photos, or long buried in time. Do you have a story in your family? Did a relative serve during the war, or perhaps bring back something unusual, a helmet, a medal, or even just a memory? We'd love to hear about it. Share your stories in the comments below. History isn't just written in books. Sometimes it's stored in boxes in our own homes. Anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.